Mark and his colleagues have done more to get CSR and shared value and society's concerns discussed in boardrooms in America than anyone. So by that corollary, Indian corporations and American corporations in India have also in some way brought those practices in India. And that impacts India's societies. For that reason, please give Mark a big round of applause because they've really been at the forefront of making sure that such issues are discussed. Mark, I understand the concept of shared value. Today, you brought it to fore in terms of how it has been implemented by Indian companies. But like most things in India, there is a huge disparity. So there is a huge rich class and there is a huge class of people who don't get enough money for meals, education. Similarly, you saw great examples. But can you talk to us about examples that are not so good, which are really equally stark, and which then, by applying the shared value concept, moved forward to a...
Well, I think in many ways the housing example is the best one, because the question of how do you provide housing for people who are living in slums, who do not have a formal employment, is a huge problem. And what was going on, these people are paying more and more rent every year and just getting poorer, as opposed to owning something that enables them to build wealth. Well, to design a solution took years of effort to really come up with a model that a family could live in but could be built for just a few $1,000s, to figure out how to get financing for it. And then the hardest part, I think, was to find builders who were willing to do this, because there was so much opportunity in the premium building market in India to make a lot of money building houses for the wealthy that they didn't want to bother with building houses for the poor, even though it was a profitable model. So they had to start in rural areas, they had to start in smaller cities. This program does not yet operate in Delhi or Mumbai, because they had to work with smaller builders who were hungry enough that they wanted to take this new opportunity. So I think one of the challenges in India is that it has been such a rapidly growing and successful economy that the incentive to go out and find new solutions to tackle social problems, to go into new lines of business that are risky, hasn't always been there. I think the success of the economy has moderated somewhat in recent years. That's unfortunate, but maybe that actually can be an incentive for business to try harder and to go into some of these new shared value opportunities that you didn't need to do when life was easier.
Also, just to give you on that particular example, most developers have to mandatorily keep a certain amount of development for disadvantaged sections, but it is sold off to other people using this disadvantaged section. So it benefits them, but it really never gets used by them. So again, that thing is misused in India.
Sure, but there's a need for literally tens of millions of houses like this.
Yeah,
and setting aside a few, which happens in many countries where developers have to reserve a few for lower income housing, is not going to get to the scale we need.
You talked about the NGOs and the large community organizations that you work across the US and in India and across the globe. Now you've dealt with Indian donor organizations, the Indian ecosystem of NGOs. And there was, about 18 months back, there was a report of the World Bank, which was published in a leading news magazine, about the state of affairs of NGOs in India. Can we really trust NGOs with the money that is supposed to funnel through the shared value concept?
I think India is still at an early stage in the development of the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. A lot of philanthropy in India, much of the major philanthropy, is still religious, which is important, nothing wrong with that, but is not necessarily directed toward innovative social issues and innovative social enterprises. A lot of it is going, back to small villages that people originally came from before they made their money. These are all good things, of course. But really using philanthropy as a lever to create social enterprises to work with companies and government for solutions, I think is something that is evolving very much in India, but is still at an early stage. And when you look at the civil society organizations, the NGOs, there is such a range. There are such remarkable, promising social enterprises that are growing. David will talk about these later, I think, that are growing in India, that are emerging, that are great opportunities for philanthropic support as well as investment. There are also organizations that are working to move India in different directions, and I know those have not always been welcome. But I think one must separate between the civil society organizations, the NGOs, that are aligned with the development of India, that are aligned with the government's incentives, that are aligned with the business opportunities and the needs of the population, and those that are not. And to treat them, and I think they need to be treated separately.
You know, Mark, one of the similarity in the criticism was that when you talk of shared value as a strategy, strategy involves trade-offs. You talked about trade-off in the last slide. The fact is the goals of the business and the goals of society need to be same, they need to converge, and that's what you're saying. But most often, the goals of business are to maximize profit, and you're saying that it actually converges. But most organizations really do not comply or actually in principle adhere to this. So that was a major criticism, that really it does not answer the trade-off question very well. It is very superficial about that.
Sure. No, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the idea, of course, and I would say the idea is still developing. I mean, we are developing course materials, Harvard Business School cases to teach. We're teaching an executive education course in a few months at Harvard, a few weeks at Harvard. And in the fall, we'll be teaching a second-year MBA course on creating shared value. And we are still really building up the body of knowledge that takes this beyond just a nice phrase and a clever idea to really solid business concepts and rigorous research. But I will say that, you know, and there are certainly companies out there that are doing this already, and we're doing this long before Michael Porter and I came along and wrote this article and came up with this term. And that's fine. And ultimately, we think this is going to become just part of how companies do business.
Sure.
You know, we don't think there needs to be, in the long run, a separate field of shared value. It just is a somewhat of a change in how companies think about their relationship to society and what their business does for society. There certainly are companies that are very, very focused on the short term. And it's particularly in the short term that we see a deviation between society's interests and the company's profitability. But for companies that think in the longer term, there is very, very much a synergy and overlap. And so one of the other things that Michael and I are working on is a piece on the investor perspective on shared value. Because as long as investors are driving companies towards short-term performance, quarter-to-quarter results, they are not going to focus on shared value, which requires a longer-term perspective. I think one of the great opportunities in India is so many of the large companies in India and the growing companies are family-owned and are privately controlled. And they do think about the long-term growth of their company for the future of their family, not just for short-term shareholder returns. And that also gives them an incentive that aligns them better with this idea of creating shared value.
Fantastic. Just to stay on that, so that, you know, in your seminal article, you talked about the fact that GE, by getting into the eco-friendly side of its business, and Walmart, you cited these two examples, that they've been really shining example of shared value. And as then was pointed out, that Walmart at that time, only about 11.5% of its business came through the line of business that you thought really aligned the company to shared value concept. And also Walmart, you know, the practices, there were very few practices that actually aligned. And the basic issues about Walmart and basic issues about GE weren't fixed. It was very superficial. Now in India, the chance of that happening is even more. And I also want to bring the backdrop of a controversy that recently happened, which has nothing to do with shared value, but in a larger context of business. is the Volkswagen controversy. Now, if you add what we said in 2012 about Walmart and GE and your example and its criticism, and you add the Volkswagen controversy, do you think companies are just even paying lip service to shared value?
Well, shared value is not about whether a company is good or evil. And again, I think people often approach this from a socially responsible investing point of view or a CSR point of view about whether a company is good or bad. At FSG, we've worked with a lot of companies that one can fault in various ways. Coca-Cola has a wonderful program in Brazil, employing and training youth in the favelas, in the slums, giving them careers, opportunities, increasing family income, but it's selling Coca-Cola, which can contribute to obesity and even diabetes. We've worked with oil and gas companies because they can be a tremendously powerful source of development and economic opportunity for communities where they operate. But of course, carbon emissions is not a good thing. So I think that Walmart indeed has saved billions of dollars from reducing their environmental footprint. And more than that, they have changed the industries because they are such a large player that when Walmart said, we want to go to only sustainably caught fish, the entire fishing industry in the United States changed. So that doesn't mean that they were paying their employees well. Business, I think any large company is doing some good things and some bad things all over the world. And there are a lot of companies, like energy companies, like Coca-Cola, who are based on a legacy model that we now know is harmful to the world and to people that we didn't know when they started their business. And the challenge they face is that they're making so much money from the legacy business, it's very hard for them to let go and shift. Nestle is a very interesting example because Nestle, starting about 10 or 15 years ago, said, you know what? Instead of being a food and beverage company, we want to be a nutrition, health, and wellness company. And we're going to create nutritional profiles for all of our products based on World Health Organization and other public data. And we're going to move our portfolio so that it moves to 100% products that align with what public officials believe are healthy content. And they're at about 80% of their portfolio at this point, and something like 98% of their products for children that align with it. And they said, we're going to get a competitive advantage because we think that there's a connection between nutrition and health. They're nutritional supplements that affect epilepsy or that affect depression. And they are creating a new business model for themselves that is midway between food and pharma, that is based on clinical trials and documented evidence of nutritional products that improve health. And so they've made a shift, but for many companies like Coca-Cola and some of the others, it's very hard to make that shift. And just a word on Volkswagen. Volkswagen is a very unfortunate example, of course. As you all know, they had been deliberately, and I would say fraudulently, concealing the emissions by a software tool that kicked in only when the car was being tested for its emissions and gave a different and passing result. That bespeaks an attitude within the company that says that whatever society is concerned about is of no interest to us. We are only about making money. We don't see ourselves as connected to society. No company that is actually following a shared value strategy could ever have that attitude within their company.
So you address the question of shared values being sometimes superficial in the sense companies do not integrate in a deep manner, and in India that danger can be even bigger than in the US or Europe. Now, let's take a future 5 years, 10 years from now. Definitely in the US, driverless cars will be a reality. It's a matter of time, whether 5, 10. So driverless cars will come to India at some point. It'll come to the US, and of course.
The tuk-tuk will be very interesting driverless.
Yeah, that'll be like, it sounds like a real possibility. We're talking of MOOCs. Now, if driverless cars happen, what happens to the numerous workers, drivers, earners that we've created? I mean, a friend of mine wrote a piece, said, don't be an MBA, be an Uber driver. Because a MBA from a B class institution gets 15,000 rupees, an Uber driver makes 25,000 rupees.
Until they're replaced by the driverless car.
Cars. But we are not, no, if we think of the shared value concept, what are we thinking about the social impact of what technology is going to bring? We're talking of MOOCs. The business of education, the business of knowledge, business of learning is going to get impacted in a way that most of us can't imagine. Now, what are we thinking about the future of teachers? I mean, in India, the number of people, my parents were academicians. So similarly, I can go on. We're not fundamentally addressing that. How do you see the shared value principle embracing that and providing solutions?
It's a great question, and I have two thoughts. I mean, first, most of these things that you're citing are actually very positive improvement. MOOCs, the idea that people can get university courses and degrees for free or for very little all over the world from the world's best professors, is a wonderful innovation. Many of these things are very good for people and for the world. And you know, I think back to the 1950s, which is when I was born, but there was great fear that, you know, computers and technology progress would put people out of work. And of course, it's true, there are not so many secretaries typing for people anymore. But the industry created a huge number of new jobs and new opportunities for people. It raised productivity, which raised standards of living, which gave great economic opportunity and enabled businesses to grow in ways they couldn't grow before. So on the one hand, I think these new innovations are wonderful. I think they will create different kinds of jobs and different kinds of opportunities than people have had before, and that's a very good thing. On the other hand, I do worry that we are moving into a world where the number of people in the world and the number of jobs are radically mismatched. But one of the things I do worry about is the idea that the number of jobs will not be anywhere near the number of people. And that will be a huge problem for the world, and it's one we already see emerging in some parts of the world.
At the GSB, there was a scandal recently, I'm sure you followed that. And where a professor who taught a course for 25 years on power, she had an affair with the dean, right? And the lady's husband. So the larger question I'm asking is, management consultants, business schools, when will they follow what they preach?
As I said earlier, while creating shared value is not about personal values are tremendously important. And I think that there is no substitute for that. And that's the only thing that can prevent the examples like Volkswagen or like this scandal at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And I think, again, there are a lot of problems that shared value is not the answer to. I think this is one of those. But again, as going back to the question about businesses that do bad things, shared value is not about trying to admonish business or trying to change the capitalist system. It's about saying there's an awful lot business can do to be of help today, even with all the things that it may do wrong. There are things to focus on where it can do good, and that's what we want to focus on.
Fantastic.